than 2,000 years, mankind has pondered over the origin of the famous Star of Bethlehem, the heavenly symbol that announced the arrival of our Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus the Christ. Now, after studying a number of historical, astronomical, and biblical records, experts have come to the conclusion that the Star of Bethlehem wasn't a star after all. But if it wasn't a star, then what was it? When did it appear? And will we see it again? Join us as we unravel the hidden history of the Star of Bethlehem.
The first place to start searching for a record of the star is, of course, in the Bible. Even there, it's only mentioned in one place, in the Gospel of St. Matthew.
Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him." Then Herod privily called the wise men, and learned of them exactly what time the star appeared. And they, having heard the king, went their way. And lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy.
This has been a mystery for 2,000 years since the original events, and people have wondered about it for centuries, whether the star was a real or whether it was something made up by the early church. And, really, that's the two basic positions people have taken historically. Believers, some people believe the Bible is true, and they say, well, the star's in the Bible, so I'm good with it. They don't worry about it. But there are other people who have a more critical attitude towards the star, and they read the story, and they say, wait a minute, that star is described as doing things that stars can't do. That must have been made up. It's a myth created by the early church to add weight to the name of Jesus of Nazareth.
The Gospel, according to St. Matthew, was written at least 70 years after the events it describes. So if I want a more reliable historical document, I'm going to have to look elsewhere. The problem is where and when to look, because of course we're not entirely sure when all this happened.
One thing we are sure of is that the Star of Bethlehem didn't appear on the 25th of December 0 AD. I've come to see the Reverend Robin Griffith-Jones to see if he can tell me where in the historical records I should be looking.
Let me ask you about the birth of Jesus. Why do we think Jesus was not born on the 25th of December 2015 years ago? I mean, this is the kind of date we have, but it's arbitrary, isn't it?
It's slightly arbitrary, but we do it in two stages. First of all, we do the time of year,
Okay.
So why do we think he was born on the 25th of December? The Romans, the pagan Romans, celebrated the end of December with huge festivities. The Saturnalia, the god Mithras, the winter solstice, everything gathered around this dark, cold time of year as they looked forward to the future and the next year. And so it's easy. You see what happened. The Christians simply took over and Christianized this.
And we're happy with that. Can we be more specific about a year, just in terms of what we're looking for here?
Of course you do. You want the year.
Can we sort of narrow it down? I mean, obviously the calendar itself that we're working with is presumably sort of post-dates that anyway.
Of course it does, yes. We've plumped for the present dating based upon the calculations of an extraordinary monk called Dionysius Exiguus. He did an extremely complicated calculation of the dates of Easter for the 95 years leading on from his own time in AD 525. And while he was about this, he realized it was an opportunity to recalibrate the entire dating system of the world, of the then Christian world. It had previously been based on the years of the Emperor Diocletian, a persecutor of the Christians. And AD had meant Anno Diocletiani, year of Diocletian. Dionysius would have none of it. He was going to start with the year of Domini, the Lord. And so he had to calculate the year of the birth of Jesus.
Right.
And he reckons that Jesus was born 753 years after the foundation of the city of Rome. Bingo! But he didn't get it right. He didn't get it right. We know, actually, a couple of mistakes he made, which meant that he ended up about 4 years out. This is good news, because we know that Jesus was born while Herod the Great was still alive.
Can I ask you about this star? You're not bothered. It had to be on the day of his birth.
Oh, goodness no.
Okay, well that's...
It might have been a year before Jesus was born. 2 years.
Thank you very much indeed. You've given me some more clues
I hope
to
so.
go on. Okay, thank you, Robin.
Real pleasure, real pleasure.
Kepler discovered the math, but he did have a problem. I mean, math was laborious back then. It was done in your head or on paper, and you have a lot of calculations if you're trying to calculate the appearance of the night sky and all the stars in it. I mean, that's a lot of work. And the man used, a quill pen and some vellum probably, and probably took a long time for him to draw a chart. Now, it would be accurate. His math was excellent, and he'd have an accurate picture, but it would be a snapshot. And if he calculated the appearance of the sky on the wrong day, or the wrong week, or the wrong hour for that matter, he might totally miss something very significant. But that all changed, today. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're hearing about the star now, because we've taken that math and put it into software. You can see the night sky from any place on the surface of the Earth at any time in history in an instant. And it's so fast you can animate the sky. Kepler was a religious guy, and so the first thing he did, once he discovered these laws, he starts cranking those laws, trying to find what? The Star of Bethlehem. He wrote 2 books on it. But Kepler missed the star. The reason he missed the star is he was looking in the skies of the wrong years. Here's the problem. Kepler had a mistaken understanding of first century history. He thought a very important man died on a certain date, and he was just wrong. The very important man was King Herod, the same King Herod who tried to kill the baby Jesus. So obviously Herod was alive when Jesus was born, and Kepler believed that Herod died in 4 BC, and so he only looked in earlier years. He looked in 5 and 6 and 7 BC for the Star of Bethlehem. When you look in those years, you don't find much. It turns out that Kepler was taking his information from the writings of one Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish scholar. He wrote at about the same time that Jesus was on earth, and he wrote Jewish histories. And from the Josephus writings, it's possible to infer the date of Herod's death. I use that word infer because he didn't use our dating system, our calendar system, so he couldn't just say 4 BC. But you can infer the date of Herod's death from Josephus' writing. Kepler thought that inference should be 4 BC. But we have new knowledge. A man took an interest in this question of when Herod died, and this gentleman went and looked at manuscripts from Josephus. He looked at in the British Museum and our museums here in the United States, and he found that all of the oldest manuscripts, every one that dates before 1544, all of them are consistent with Herod having died in 1 BC. And that opens up the possibility for us to look in the years 2 and 3 BC for the star. And when you look there, the sky explodes. Let's go to the stars in the Bible, and we're going to learn that God takes credit for the constellations, takes credit for the stars. In Job 9, Job is talking. He says, God is the maker of the Bear and Orion, the Pleiades, and the constellations of the south. Later in the book, God is putting Job in his place, and God says, hey, Job, can you bind the beautiful Pleiades? Can you loose the cords of Orion? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons? The answer, no. He's saying, Job, I made the stars. I made the constellations. I'm running the show. I'm controlling it all. So here's God taking credit for the constellations and stars. Let's have a look and see what Isaiah says. Isaiah writes, lift your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls them each by name. He calls them each by name. Because of God's great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. What does it mean to be missing? It means to be out of place, not where you belong. You mean all the stars, hundreds upon hundreds of billions of stars, are right where God wants them? David writes, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth. Their words to the ends of the world. Now, isn't it interesting that David chooses verb after Hebrew verb, all different, to say that the stars communicate? Fascinating. Now, in Romans, Paul is asking a rhetorical question. The rhetorical question is, did the Jews know the Messiah had come? Paul's kind of shocking answer was, yeah, of course they knew. But what I like is the structure of his argument. Look at his argument. Paul says, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word of Christ. But I asked, did they, my people, the Jews, not hear? Of course they did. And then he quotes David. He says, their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Let me just paraphrase that now. What Paul is saying, yeah, the Jews, my people, knew the Messiah had come because the stars told them. Now, do you make that argument unless something interesting has happened in the sky? You don't make that argument. So obviously something did happen in the sky. What was that? That's what we want to know. That's what we're trying to find out. So let's go to the 2nd chapter of Matthew and look at the clues. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, so you see again how important it is when Herod died. If Herod died in 4 BC, you look in later years, but we think he died in 1, so we're looking in 2 and 3 BC. Magi came from the east to Jerusalem. Okay, gotta ask, what's a magus? Same word root as our word magic. Are they magicians? You know, the one showed up in Acts and he was a bad actor, so some of them were bad.
Some scholars think the Magi are Mesopotamian. Mesopotamia, in particular Babylon, had a great reputation for astronomy and astrology. So there was a sense in which if men were going to come from the east, they were likely to be from Mesopotamia.
What would today be Iraq, a part of the world, of course, in those days with a very rich culture. Babylon, Nineveh, Sippar.
We don't know that much about the Magi. We don't even really know how many there were. We think there were 3 only because there are 3 gifts mentioned in Scripture. But we do know something about Magi, at least, because we have the writings of a Jewish philosopher and historian named Philo. Philo lived in Alexandria, Egypt, in the large Jewish community there, and he was a copious writer. And Philo does discuss Magi. And he describes a particular school of Magi. He calls it the Eastern School. And these Magi he praises. He says these guys understand the natural order, and they're able to explain the natural order to others. And they were, according to Philo, probably what we might call something like proto-scientists. They were the scientists of their day. At least this fancy Eastern school of Magi was of that character. Now, we don't know that these Magi in Scripture are from that Eastern school, but don't you think it's interesting that Matthew wants us to know they came from the East? I think he's telling us these Magi were from the good school. Impressive Magi. The Magi asked a question that's just loaded with clues. They said, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Those 3 clues right there. Did you see them go by? Whatever the Magi saw in the sky suggested to them birth, the Jewish nation, and kingship. Next, they say, we saw his star in the east. I'm going to stop there because I have to correct the translation a little bit. When it says we saw his star in the east, okay, sure, they were in the east, and so yes, they saw his star when they were in the east, but that's not the sense of the Greek. The Greek says they saw the star on Anatole, which means rising in the east, and that's a clue. Watch Herod's reaction. When Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Everybody who heard the story that the Magi presented was disturbed. When they heard about the star from the Magi, they were shocked. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. Now what's going to happen is his chief priests and teachers, they're going to quote the ancient prophet Micah. And it's a fateful prophecy, too, that Micah makes. In fact, if Micah hadn't made this prophecy, Herod wouldn't have killed little babies in Bethlehem. The king's experts say, in Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet Micah has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. That's how Herod decided to kill the babies. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. That's the 2nd time one clue is coming by. He doesn't know when the star appeared. He had to ask. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. 2 more clues. It went ahead of them as they went from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. Let's do that one first. You may not know the geography of Israel. You don't need a map. You don't need a star. You don't need a guide to find Bethlehem from Jerusalem. It's 5 miles south on the main road. You can see Bethlehem from Jerusalem. So it's just 5 miles south, so we know the star, whatever it was, had to be ahead of them as they were headed due south. Okay? Oh, you know what else? There's another clue I have to pull out of this for you. Remember that they saw the star when they were in the east, and then they traveled to Jerusalem, and then they saw the star still? That means the star endured over time. And then here's the tough one. Here's the toughest of all the 9 points. Until it stopped over the place where the child was. Can a star stop? You wouldn't think so, but it can and did, and I'm going to show you. Several ancient cultures kept excellent astronomical records, notably the Chinese.
Back on the quest for historical evidence for the star, I've directed my search several thousand miles further east. Because the Babylonians weren't the only ancient civilization to make astronomical observations, the Chinese were also making detailed records of everything they saw in the sky. Christopher Cullen is an expert in ancient Chinese astronomy. And how accurate a record is this? I mean, this was written a long time ago before what we would recognise as science, if you like, was happening.
This was written by professionals. The Emperor maintains a staff of sky watchers whose job is to be up there noting down everything that happens. And there's a reason for that. It's explained on the first page of this chapter, chapter 26. The stars and planets, all the lights up there, are a great control panel of indicator lights. And if one of them starts blinking, or if a light appears where it's unexpected, that means something big is happening, because everything in the sky mirrors what's happening on the Earth.
So it was the same idea, this idea of portents and omens of what was going on in the sky reflected human concerns. Okay, so here's the question. Is there anything of note in this book that we should look at in terms of bright objects?
Well, the nice thing about Chinese books is that they all got dates in them. So we turn through the chapter, looking at everything's got a date there, and we come to near the end of the chapter, and we see in the second year, that's 5 BC.
5 BC, okay, well that's ballpark, yeah.
Second month, that's lunar month. This is early March to early April.
Which, again,
this
nice. Sounds good.
A broom star appeared in the constellation of the Ox for more than 70 days. Will that do you?
Well, that's pretty good. So by broom star, presumably we're talking about a comet.
When you see records of movement and statements about how long it was, like a tail, it's usually called a broom star. I go probably for a comet, but it doesn't have to be. But if to check that, look at the next entry. The next entry tells us basically that a little later, Jupiter was seen moving through a certain constellation, and they say it did this retrograde loop. It's where you do a calculation to check, you find that, that date is when Jupiter would have done a retrograde loop. There are other things like the moon going in front of a particular star. You can check, and it did.
You go to the records, you look in the years 2 and 3 BC, which is our hypothesis, no comets. But the one that persuades me the best, the one that I think is the strongest evidence that it wasn't a comet, is that's kind of a funny clue, where Herod was surprised about it. Look, if a comet appears in that ancient culture where everybody sees the sky most and every night, are people going to know about it? Yeah, and it's an omen of doom. It's going to be the talk in town. I mean, everybody's going to be buzzing about it. So probably not a comet. Well, how about a nova, an exploding star? Now, they appear at a point in time. That's good. Last over time. They rotate. I mean, I should say they rise in the east. Probably not a nova, though, for the same reasons. You look at the Chinese records, there aren't any novae recorded. And also, Herod would not have had to ask. You know, if the thing appears, everyone's going to know. When you go outside and look up tonight, you're going to see just this huge canopy of stars. We often visualize it as a sphere over the Earth. And those stars, most of them in that sphere, they move very, very slowly. Most stars then are in the fixed class. But then there are the wandering stars, the planets. And the planets move around through the field of fixed stars. They do interesting things. So might one of these wandering stars have something to do with Messiah's star? Well, that's going to be our working hypothesis. Anybody tell me what's the largest planet in the solar system? It's Jupiter. Jupiter's named for the highest god in the Roman pantheon. It's a gas giant, we call it. It's the biggest planet by far. So might Jupiter, which has been known as the king planet from ancient times because it's the biggest one, might Jupiter have something to do with Messiah's star? Well, that's going to be a hypothesis that we can test. Now, it's not going to be enough to have a kingly name. Jupiter's going to have to do some pretty peculiar things to satisfy all 9 points from the Bible. So we can view from any place we like. I'm choosing to view from Babylon. And you can choose to choose any time to view, and we're viewing 3 BC. It's September. This is the compass rose. It says east, and this red line is the path of Jupiter through the sky. I've turned it on just to make it easier for you to follow Jupiter. Now, when I animate the sky, what's going to happen is you're going to watch the screen increment. And it's going to kind of do it stepwise. And what's happening in between those steps is the program is running through all that math to make sure that exactly what you see is exactly what happened. So let's take a look. And we see Jupiter rising. Oh, cool, Mr. Larson. There better be more, right? Oh, yeah, there's more. I'm already messing with you, though, because there are actually 2 things here. Can you see the 2 objects there? Let me take you to another screen so I can enlarge it without messing this screen up. I'm just going to zoom in. And as I zoom in, you'll find that there are 2 objects there. This is Jupiter. The smaller object is a star. It has a name. It's called Regulus. That's the same word root as our word regal. The Babylonians called Regulus Sharu, which means king. The Romans called Regulus Rex, which means king. This is the king star. We now have the king planet and the king star coming into very close approach. Now, I'd already told you that wandering stars move about in the field of fixed stars, right? But they don't do it correctly. Just so you know, the planets misbehave. Let me show you what they do. Here's what it looks like. Here's what Mars looks like as it moves through the fixed stars. It moves along like you'd expect it to, but then it slows down and loops. Continues on a ways and loops again. Well, what's with that, Mars? That's pretty weird, isn't it? Okay, I mean, it's looping through the sky like that. That's exactly what it looks like, but of course it's optical. It's what astronomers call retrograde motion. Retrograde motion. Jupiter's retrograde is very shallow, if I can get my star to go on. Jupiter goes like this. It slows up. It doesn't blink like that. And does a very shallow little circle. Kind of a little like that. Yeah, it kind of looks like a halo over somebody. So did Jupiter do that at an interesting time? Well, yes, it did. Let's take a look. I'll animate Jupiter and let it drop a tail so you can watch it. Jupiter passed Regulus, changed its mind, stopped and went back for a second close approach. That's 2. Passed Regulus again, changed its mind, and came back for a third close approach. Triple conjunction, much more rare, much more rare. And if you choose to see it, Jupiter has just drawn a halo or a crown over the king planet. Interesting. I can see king there, can't you? I can see king, 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 right? Some people would say, well, king, 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 you know, new king, or maybe it means birth. I don't know. I can't get much more out of that, but I do see king there. Very true. A lot of stuff still missing, though. I mean, I don't see the Jewish nation up there anyplace. So, of course, there's more. Next, I want to ask you a question. 12 Jewish tribes. One produces Messiah. Which one? Anybody know? You're right. Say it louder. It's Judah. That's right. What's the animal symbol for the tribe of Judah? That's correct. Okay, good. Let me take you to the first book of the Bible and look at Genesis 49 for a prediction of the coming Messiah. We read, "You're a lion's cub, O Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom the scepter belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his." If we look at the sky and turn on the constellations, we'll see that Jupiter has been crowning Regulus right here in the constellation Leo the Lion. Well, now I can see an association with the Jewish nation. I can see king, king, king in Leo. Well, that's pretty interesting. That's pretty cool. But there's something even bigger that I got to show you that really spooked me when I saw it.
And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron.
We saw the prediction in Genesis, and here in Revelation, he appears again, and he's got that scepter, because he's now the King of Kings. So, if the child is Jesus, who's the woman? Yeah, that's pretty easy. Okay. And in metaphorical terms, who's the dragon that waited at the foot of the woman to devour the child? That's Herod. The dragon is Herod. John elsewhere tells us in Revelation that the dragon is Satan, but we know in human terms it was Herod. So we now understand what he's describing is the birth of Jesus, but he sees it in the heavens. I'm going to show you something now that definitely got all the little hairs up on the back of my neck and the back of my arm. And because what follows Jupiter into the sky as we animate the sky is Virgo, the Virgin. And she's clothed in the sun. And she has the moon at her feet. It's just a crescent moon, a very small crescent, barely visible moon. There's a reason for that. This is Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. So I'm looking at all this stuff happening, and everything's just, really moving me. And I'm thinking, man, this may be the birth of Jesus. And then I thought, wait a minute, maybe not. Because Jewish people and a lot of Christian people believe that life begins at conception. So I thought to myself, well, maybe this is the conception of Jesus. Maybe this is the Annunciation, when Gabriel appeared to Mary and she said, "Be it done unto me." Well, you can test that, I thought. Well, let's just wind forward 9 months and see if there's anything interesting happening in the sky. So that's what I did. So let's jump forward 9 months. Now, we're still reading from Babylon because I don't think they've left yet. It's now 2 BC. It's June. It's 9 months later. Jupiter has finished crowning Regulus in Leo and is now moving backwards through the constellations like it always does. Incidentally, if you're in Babylon and you're looking west, what are you looking toward? Israel. Okay. Now I'm going to show you something that you can see in any planetarium around the world. Even if they don't believe in Jesus or the Bible or anything, they're going to show you this at Christmas. Because all planetaria do Christmas shows. That's the only way they can get you in there, right? And they always show this event because this event is simply so spectacular. Whether they believe in God or not, they're going to show you this shot. I'm going to kind of cheat as I show it to you, though, because observation back then was all naked eye observation. They had no lenses. So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to zoom in because I want to show you guys. I'm going to take you in on the secret of what's happening here. They couldn't zoom, but we can. So I'm going to zoom in, way in. Until finally, I get those two objects separated. One of them's Jupiter. The other one's another planet. You're going to tell me which one, too. Men are from Mars. Women are from Venus. That's the mother planet. Venus is the mother planet. So we have Jupiter, the king planet, and Venus, the mother planet, coming into very close conjunction. That seems kind of pregnant, doesn't it? In fact, they got even closer than that. Let me wind time forward just a little bit. What I'm trying to show you is that they really stacked like a figure eight. So they didn't block each other's light. They added. What you had then was two stars stacked on top of each other, too close together to separate with the naked eye. And so to an observer, it appeared to be the brightest star anyone alive had ever seen. We know the math, and so I can tell you that no one alive had ever seen a star that bright. That was it. I believe the star of Bethlehem was the brightest star. So we've seen the birth of the king in the sky. We've seen the brightest star. But now we have the issue of it being in the south. Remember when they were traveling from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, the star is said to have been before them, ahead of them. So it would have to be in the southern sky. So let's go back to the sky, see if Jupiter did that. They've now traveled to Jerusalem. It's November. I've given them some time for travel. This is south. Remember, Bethlehem is due south of Jerusalem. And at 7 in the morning, sure enough, there in the sky, in the southern sky, is Jupiter over the little town of Bethlehem. Jupiter comes to a full stop and reverses course over the little town of Bethlehem. But I want to show you another screen that's more fun because I can throw dates with it. Now, what I'm going to do on this one is I'm going to let Jupiter fly through the field of fixed stars, and it's going to throw off dates so we can tell when these events are happening. The first one there, I know it's small. I'll read it for you. It says 10:30 of 2 BC. Now, let's fly Jupiter. You see it moving through the fixed stars. That says 11:25 of 2 BC, and it's slowing up. It's going to stop right about here, reverse course. The date when it stopped over the little town of Bethlehem, 12:25 of 2 BC. Does that date sound familiar? Well, Mr. Larson, you mean they went down there on Christmas? Well, it turns out that's true. Am I saying that Jesus was born on 12/25? No, I'm not saying that at all. Absolutely. In fact, I don't think anyone thinks that. Let me give you the chronology now. In September of 3 BC, Jupiter crowns Regulus in Leo. Up rises Virgo, clothed in the sun. New moon, birthed at her feet, Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year. 9 months later, the biggest planet goes together with the brightest planet to make the brightest star anyone alive had ever seen. Where? Right over Jerusalem as it sets. The Magi ride. They get there sometime around November. They go to Herod and they say, "We've seen the star. Where's the baby king?" Herod says, "Bethlehem." So they're leaving the gates of Jerusalem to go to Bethlehem, 5-mile trek. And they look up, and there's the star. There's Jupiter, right over this little town of Bethlehem. One of the guys, who's the guy who does the math for the group, he's going, wait. It's in full retrograde. It stopped right over the little town of Bethlehem. They ride down to Bethlehem on 12:25, 2 BC. We know that's the date because that's when the star stopped. They're carrying gifts, remember? Frankincense, gold, and myrrh. They find the baby boy. Is he living in a manger? No. He's moved. He's in a house now. He's described in Greek as a paidion. He's a toddler. They find the baby boy and they present these fabulous gifts to him on what turns out to be the first Christmas, 1225 of 2 BC. It turns out in my studies, I find that the Star of Bethlehem is the beginning of what I think of as a celestial poem that ends at Christ's death. And to show you the full poem, I've got to take you to the day of the cross. I'm going to talk to you about Pentecost, but first I kind of have to give you some background so you'll understand. Jesus was killed at Passover. The next Jewish holiday is a feast. It's called the Feast of Pentecost. It's called Pentecost because it comes 50 days after Passover, so it's Pentecost. Now, Pentecost is a festival, and Jews who could afford to travel came from all the surrounding nations, came back to Jerusalem for this festival, so a lot of out-of-towners in town. Let's do the chronology of Christ's death. Remember, he dies on Passover, he's buried, he rises again. Bible says that he then appears to people on earth, stays around for 40 days. So he almost makes it to Pentecost, doesn't he? Then he leaves, and he gives instructions, and he says, stay here until you receive power from on high. So they do. The disciples stay in one place, and they're all gathered together, and Pentecost comes, and the weirdest things start happening. Something like a sound of rushing wind happens in the room where they are. Something like fire dances over their heads, and suddenly the disciples begin to speak in foreign languages, other tongues. People who are in town for the Pentecost feast hear the commotion. The crowd starts to gather, and these out-of-towners are hearing their own languages being spoken by a bunch of Galilean fishermen. It gets crazy. The crowd gets big enough that there are hecklers in the back, and one of the hecklers shouts out, says, "Oh, they're just drunk." Peter stands up and says, "They're not drunk. It's only 9 in the morning." Now, I lecture to a lot of college students, and I'm wondering, this is persuasive? So the next thing he does, don't try on your own. What he does next is crazy. He's got a huge crowd, and it's kind of an unruly crowd. He's got hecklers and stuff. And so Peter stands up, and he starts quoting an ancient prophet. This is what he says. He quotes Joel. And he says, "I will show wonders in the heaven above and signs on the earth below. Blood," well, there's been a crucifixion. "Fire," something like fire danced over the disciples' heads. "And billows of smoke, and the sun will be turned to darkness." I think Joel saw a vision of something like smoke that blotted out the sun. "The sun will be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood." The moon turned to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. "And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." And then he shouts at him. He says, "Men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know." Now, let me tell you why I put italics there. That's a very interesting argument. Let me paraphrase what just happened. Got a rowdy crowd out here. Peter stands up, and he says basically this: Joel predicted a bunch of stuff, and you've seen it. Now, you don't make that argument, especially to a rowdy crowd, unless they've seen the stuff. And one of the things they are said to have seen was a blood moon. Well, here's the gist of what we've just seen. Peter says that Joel said that there's a blood moon, and you've seen it. So there was an eclipse. Interesting. Now we need to date Christ's execution. The reason we have to do that is otherwise we won't know to look at the sky. We need to know what day we should study the sky to see the end of this poem that I'm showing you. So we have clues. First, we know it was preparation day. It was just before the Passover feast. That's super useful because we know when Passover is. We find from Leviticus, the Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. That's the Jewish lunar month of Nisan. The Jewish calendar is not a solar calendar like the one we use. So all these things taken together, plus more stuff on the website, come to one conclusion. Only April 3 of 33 AD seems to fit all the lines of evidence. This is the day of the cross. Isaiah says the Messiah was beaten so severely he was hardly recognizable as human. And in that state, they put him on the cross at 9 a.m. He only lasted about 6 hours. But while he was on the cross, all hell broke loose. There were earthquakes, big earthquakes, big enough to bust boulders because the New Testament tells us this. The sky gets dark at noon. Joel, in his vision of this event, seems to describe billowing clouds of smoke that obscured the sun. Tombs get shaken open. There's a veil in the Holy of Holies in the temple at Jerusalem. It separates the deepest part of the sanctuary from all the people who come to church, synagogue. That was ripped in half from top to bottom, symbolizing ordinary folks having direct access to the Holy of Holies, to God himself, because Messiah's sacrifice made it possible. They had to get him down off the cross before sundown. They had to do that, because otherwise he would defile the Passover. So they got him down. But the signs didn't stop. When the moon rose that evening, it was a blood moon, a lunar eclipse, which probably scared everybody there to death. I mean, I can really honestly think, having lived through all of those events and then seeing the blood moon, being scared spitless. When the moon rises, it's already in eclipse. It's a blood moon. Now, I don't know what the Roman soldiers said when they saw that, but don't you know they were freaked out? I mean, seriously. After all these events during the day, and then the moon comes up and it's a blood moon, they're probably thinking, oh man, wrong side of this one. But there's more, and I want you to see it all. It was the third hour when they crucified him, Mark tells us, and Mark counts from 6, so he's telling us he went on the cross at 9 a.m. At the 6th hour, which is noon, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. So I'm now taking him beneath the horizon. It's 2 p.m. Jesus is on the cross and he's still alive. When I animate the sky, I don't think you're going to be surprised at what you see. As Jesus expires on the cross, the moon goes into eclipse. But there's more. And you see the moon has returned to the foot of Virgo. But now it's a full moon, a life fully lived, blotted out in blood. What does this mean? You know, human beings have a characteristic response when they see a sign. They draw near to learn the fuller message. That's what Moses did when he saw the bush that burned but wasn't consumed by the flames. He drew near to learn the fuller message. It's what the Magi did when they saw the symbolism in the sky. They rode for Jerusalem to learn the fuller message. So what does this mean? Well, one thing it means is you can press the scriptures extremely hard and they hold up. But it means more than that. I believe it means Messiah has come. Our Messiah was announced in the sky. It's possible for us to have reconciliation with the perfect God because of Messiah's sacrifice. We just have to accept that.
We are on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It is 3 a.m. on September 23rd, 2017. The first constellation in the great sign is rising above the horizon. This is Leo, the constellation of the royal lion. When the dawn breaks, we'll see that Leo is worn as a crown of royalty by the virgin princess. The lion forms the appropriate crown for her because she is of the house of David, the lion of the tribe of Judah. Significantly, this is the highest royal lineage of all the nations. This means the virgin is also born of the lineage of the high scepter of the seed of Adam. In her belly is the second Adam, the Savior of the world. On this fateful day, the Virgin is clothed in the sun, and the moon is at her feet. Sunlight floods the sky, and since the Virgin is clothed in the sun, we cannot see her, so we turn off her artwork. But the prophecy clearly states that the great sign is to appear in the heaven. High noon approaches. Then, on this special day, the sun turns as black as sackcloth, and the stars quickly fill the sky. Just like on the day of the crucifixion, it will remain dark for an incredible 3 hours. We stop the motion and zoom in. We fill the screen with our 2 constellations. To better see how the constellations are formed, we generate blue lines between their stars. Then we turn off the constellation artwork, leaving us with the lines of each constellation. We first turn our attention to the constellation of Leo. In Leo, the alpha or brightest star is Regulus, the regal king star. 8 additional bright stars are used to form the constellation. But this leaves us 3 stars short of the 12 stars prophesied to crown the Virgin. On this special day, 3 wandering stars are in rare formation within the boundaries of Leo. They are Venus, Mars, and Mercury. This gives us the prophesied 12 stars to form the crown. Now we move to Virgo. Her left hip is formed by the alpha star named Spica, which means the seed. Her right hip is formed by the zeta star named Hes, which means the branch. On this day, the Virgin is to give birth to the king planet between these 2 stars. Also, the king planet has just spent 9 months in the belly of the Virgin, reinforcing the prophetic imagery of the Scriptures. To illustrate this wonder, we will now run the clock backward for a year. Notice that the king planet stops and turns around twice in retrograde motion while in the belly of the Virgin. In turn, the moon flies by along the ecliptic every month. This action by the moon will give us a means to mark the passing of the months. We stop our backward motion. We now change into forward motion. We pause the motion as Jupiter enters the belly of the Virgin. Now count the times that the moon flies by while Jupiter is in the Virgin's belly. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And in just under 10 months, we arrive back at our fateful day, September 23rd, 2017. Now we will recap the prophetic imagery in the great sign. First, we have Virgo, the Virgin Princess, imaging the Virgin Mary. Second, the Virgin is clothed in the sun, imaging the life-giving Spirit of God. Third, the crescent moon is at her feet, heralding this day as the Jewish Feast of Trumpets. Fourth, on this day, the Virgin also has a special crown of 12 stars, representing the lineage of the high throne of the nation of Israel. Fifth, the Virgin gives birth to the crown prince, the Messiah. Sixth, the crown prince has just spent a long 9 months in her womb, the time of human gestation. Seventh, so we can see this wonder, a special heavenly event causes the sky to fall dark for 3 hours in the middle of the day. The combination of all 7 of these independent actions into a great sign brings to life the exact imagery of the prophecy. This wonder was described in detail in Revelation chapter 12, nearly 2,000 years ago. The astounding fulfillment of this great prophecy is like a clarion blast of God's trumpet, broadcasting to all that the sign is a magnificent herald of end times events. Furthermore, its appearance is to occur on the exact day the Lord intends, a plan He laid out before He created the heavens. This means the great sign is an event that cannot be anything less than a miraculous herald of prophetic events. On this day, a famous comet carrying the Rosetta probe is beside the crescent moon. This comet bodes a day of disaster for the moon god of Islam. At noon, the foot of the Virgin is on one side of the moon, the comet is on the other. By the end of the day, the moon will be under the Virgin's feet. This day in 2017 is also unique for other reasons. As mentioned, this is the day of the Feast of Trumpets, one of the 7 appointed feasts of the Lord. The 7 feasts are prophetic of the 7 most significant events in redemptive history. Jesus was crucified on the first spring feast. This is the day of the first fall feast. In turn, this day on this unique year is also on the weekly 7th-day Sabbath. Finally, it is also the day of the fall equinox. Incredibly, all of these date markers in the heavens are occurring on the same day on the Lord's calendar. The day progresses. At 3 in the afternoon, the eclipse will be over. The sun reappears and shines for 3 more hours before it sets in the west. At this point, the great wonder becomes the herald of great terror. The heavenly body that blocked the sun for 3 hours is immense enough to carry large debris rings of ice and sulfur, rings composed of material much like the rings of Saturn, only larger. Soon the earth must pass through one of these rings. This is when the firestorm of the Golden Empire occurs. It is the day of the death of Babylon the Great, which is the proud city of Sodom, which is the unrepentant empire. In 1 hour's time, 1/3 of mankind will die. Foreseeing the intensity of the hour, the Lord has foretold time and again that not one person who calls upon his name will be lost. The shouting and terror begins. In contrast, unmitigated disaster falls upon the Western world. The wise men had the eyes to see that the Star of Bethlehem meant a prophetic day was upon them. They then acted on what they saw. Do you have the eyes to see that the great sign from heaven means a prophetic day is upon you?
Because if we found the star, and a reasonable person could conclude that we have, well, then the star was part of the natural order. The solar system is like a great clock. It's mathematically precise. We know exactly what it looked like thousands of years ago. And if the star was a part of that great clockwork solar system and universe, that means it was a clockwork star. And that, to me, is almost overwhelming, because that means that from the very moment that God flung the universe into existence, he had to know exactly when he would enter the human race as a man and when Messiah would expire on the cross, because he marked in the stars from before time.
There appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven. And behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth the man-child, who was to rule all nations with the rod of iron.